through the Q&A feature and can interact with staff running the webinar through the chat function for technical questions. Attendees will not be able to chat with other attendees. Live transcript is available through Zoom. And a survey at the end of this webinar series will be sent to all registered participants to gather feedback and ideas for next year's celebrations. Joining the conversation this evening are San Mateo County thought leaders and advocates. We'd like to start with introducing Monet Boyd, she, her pronouns. She's the staff planner for Bay Area Regional Health and Equities Initiative. Darius Young, he, him pronouns, Director of Organizing for Black Health, Bay Area Regional Health and Equities Initiative as well. And Pastor Paul Baines, he, him pronouns, President and founder of We Hope and United Hope Builders. Thank you all for joining the conversation this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's great to see you. Juneteenth, short for June 19, marks the actual Emancipation Day on June 19, 1865, which liberated slaves in Texas, seemingly awarding freedom, though the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln 2.5 years earlier in 1863. And yes, enslaved people did not know that they were in fact free for 2 years after Lincoln's signing. Accompanying the Emancipation Proclamation was Special Field Order Number 15, issued by Union General William T. Sherman, which redistributed land to freed slaves, men, in 40-acre plots. An earlier agreed upon form of reparations, this order, known to current generations as 40 acres and a mule, was rescinded in 1865, shortly after being issued, resulting in land and subsequently home ownership disparities for Black people to present day. Of course, there is much more history that we will not have time to unpack tonight. Still, we can begin to explore housing as a basic human right, proclaimed in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as set forth by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. This was 83 years after emancipation. So Monet, I'd like to start the conversation with you. How do you see this housing crisis that we're currently in relating to the Juneteenth holiday that we're commemorating?
All righty, yeah, I'll start it off. How are you all doing? I think it connects to the Juneteenth, how our housing crisis connects to the Juneteenth holiday in so many ways. I think about my ancestors wanting freedom, liberation, and access to capital and money. And we know that housing is one of the biggest ways to access wealth and capital in America. And a lot of Black folks have barriers to that. And I think when we think about freedom and liberation in Juneteenth, and what our ancestors thought was that they would have access to everything that everyone else in America had and currently has access to. And we still have so many barriers because of that system of slavery and oppression. And we see it happening currently within in housing. And also working at Bar High, we see that the lack of housing has caused not only gaps in wealth, but also health disparities. Black folks are experiencing a decade-long difference in life expectancy due to the lack of housing and also the housing burden. But I could go on and on. But yeah, I'll pass it over to Darius, right?
Thanks. Okay. So Darius, yeah, please join in the conversation. Welcome. Thanks again for being here.
Well, I thank Monet for those very good highlights. And I would say that housing and Juneteenth, they go together for a number of reasons. Okay, first of all, we know that the slaves, in Texas, they remained slaves, for 2-something years, right? After the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. And so freedom And I think housing has connections because one of the things that we do know is that to be free here in America means that you get to own land, you get to build wealth, you get to do all of those things. And for too many of African Americans that came to California with the hope when they left the South, and they left as refugees, hoping for a better life here than what they had in the South. And even though the signs weren't up, that said you can't do this or you can't live here, they came in and they experienced redlining. They were relegated to the smallest communities, the smallest neighborhoods, and it had houses and homes that were overcrowded. And I think that was well documented in Richard Rothstein's book, who actually started his book off here in the Bay Area and talked about San Mateo County and East Palo Alto. And so housing and freedom go hand in hand. And even though we might be free to go about here or there, we are still not free when it comes to the access to housing, wealth, and land here in America, because it's this, and in the Bay Area, San Mateo, and we can go on and on. So I do think these are the parallels that the two coexist. So, and I'll pass it on to our friend Pastor Baines.
Thank you. I don't know how much more I can really add to what both Darius and Monet spoke. I mean, if you look at it, even before the founding of our country, African Americans were denied the ability to accumulate wealth, and slavery obviously denied that access to Black men and women. So we could not benefit from the fruits of our labor. We worked hard, but we were not able to obtain, even when they promised us 40 acres and a mule, that was even taken away from us. So historically, that's you cannot end right if you don't start off right a lot of the times. And then even after slavery, 1864, 65, you still have a plethora of programs that also held back African Americans. Black businesses couldn't get loans and what have you. And as he mentioned, the redlining that occurred right here, even in East Palo Alto in Northern California, the massacre on Black Wall Street in Tulsa. There's just so many different episodes. And I think it was, it might have been the US Census, something I was reading where it said over 50 years, Blacks were, it had not, I guess you say it this way, 11 million acres over 15 years was taken away from Black people. And in my book, no land, no landing, because God's not making any more land. So, if you don't start off with something, it's really hard to deal and address that wealth gap.
Well, Pastor Baines, let's take a step back if we can. And for some of our attendees, elaborate a little bit on redlining and share exactly what it is and how it impacts communities and counties, San Mateo and beyond, if you will.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at and it's not just San Mateo County, even though I know that's what we're focusing in on. I mean, whites compared to Blacks, they have 73% home ownership compared to Blacks having home ownership in America. And a reason is because we were denied to be able to live in the so-called quality neighborhoods. The banks would say, okay, well, you're a Black person, we're going to subjugate you to living in the poorest part of the communities, and they would not give you loans, Black people loans, so that we can actually buy the houses. We have to constantly having to rent the houses. And for that to occur, you can work as hard as you want to and work and have just the same income as a non-Black person, but then you don't get qualified, you don't get approved for that loan. So access to funding, to finances, to resources, that stopped us from being able to generate wealth.
Thank you, sir, for that. So Darius, let me ask you, why do you think housing is central to the conversation about Black freedom in the United States?
Well, it's central to the conversation because if you look at African Americans in the United States, one source of freedom, we only make up, I believe it's 13% of the population. However, we were over incarcerated in the conditions. And so that's freedom within itself, right? And if you look at some of the components of incarceration, mass incarceration, it has a lot to do with environment and housing in particular, right? Most of the individuals that I have been in contact with, and I work with a lot of youth in one of the county juvenile halls. And just recently, we had a conversation about living conditions. And out of the 14 young men that were in the group, 9 of them were African American and the other were Latinos. And out of the 9 African American, 7 said that in the last 2 years prior to incarceration, their family lived in 4 different cities to 3, 4, no stable housing, right? And so when you look at that part of freedom, but then the other part that I look at when it comes to freedom, that if you don't own wealth or you don't have wealth, then you don't have as much access to power, and power is freedom. So we can talk about power in the form of politics, to be able to lobby and invest in things and policies and sound policies that we want to move you further. You can talk about access to be able to determine how your school district operates. And all those things are like freedom. And so I've just really began to connect health with housing and for all the systemic issues that we really face today. And I could also say that the California Reparations Task Force, they spent a great deal of time looking at housing. And as a matter of fact, one of the members made a quote in, I believe it was the report, that said, if we throw out slavery in California and the United States alone, we can just start looking, we should be given reparations for housing, for the denial of housing. So, and the access to that. And so all those things goes to freedom, because everybody else who is doing well economically in America, those who have other immigrants who have immigrated over here, where we didn't immigrate, we were forcibly removed from the land, they've made a stake in America, from housing, and even to what you look at as income to housing ratios. So yeah, it's freedom.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And in fact, what's interesting is to understand that, in 1865, as freedom for enslaved people was becoming a right, was becoming their reality, these first attempts at reparations regarding land, which would again subsequently result in housing, was rescinded. So that means that there was a considerable amount of freedom that would have been allowed as one began to live their life and establish their family and their identity in particular regions and locations that was no longer there. So while someone may be free, albeit 2 years notification late, which we've talked about, I now have nowhere to go. So I think that brings me to a question about San Mateo County specifically. And Monet, I'm going to ask you about the housing impact for Black people specifically in San Mateo County and the surrounding regions. I believe it's 9 counties that you and Darius both work with and advocate for. And if I have nowhere to go, how free am I really, even in present day?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Cleature, because in speaking, so with Bar High, we work regionally, and we are the governmental the agency of the governmental public health departments, and we work on the issues outside the doctor's office in the Bay Area, right? And so we came together and did a study in 2018 to talk about the impacts of racism, health, and housing. And we wanted to prove to people that it's not just in the 3 big cities, that it's not just in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose, but that it's a region-wide issue. And we were correct in our thinking, and that folks are being impacted because of decades of discrimination, unequal access to wealth and quality jobs, and high housing costs, and of course other factors. And what was particularly interesting about the study that we put together, and when we dove a little bit deeper into the information, was that folks are being displaced at like crazy rates. And so some of the rates that we saw, San Francisco 49%, Oakland 40%, Berkeley 49%, but right here, East Palo Alto, San Mateo County, 66%. Black folks alone are being pushed out at a point of 66%. And so, and I think it's so important that you raise that question, where do I go when all over the county, or not even just all over the county, but all over the region that I know the prices are high. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important for us to think about regional strategies, because like I mentioned, we have we have an issue not only just in San Mateo County, but region-wide. And so that's what Darius and I have been working on our regional Black housing agenda, to create a Black housing fund where we work to help folks with affordable home ownership, give access to Black developers, because we not only need housing, but we need quality housing in our neighborhoods. We need quality housing and quality community infrastructure in our neighborhoods. And so I think we are really working with this fund to give access to residents, to Black developers, and to release those barriers around home ownership and make capital more flexible and accessible to Black folks. But I think that and I think we see the consequence of it being so expensive in the region that people are even leaving the state. Mm-hmm. And leaving California and leaving, and I feel like the strain that we see is that the legacy that we had of strong Black communities in the Bay Area and being known for, like Darius mentioned, being known for having like Oakland, Black Panthers, and having these strong communities are leaving because we can't afford it. We can't afford to keep our grandmothers and our grandfathers' legacy here. And so I think those are some of the consequences that we have when we have such expensive and high housing costs and burden.
Yeah, that's pretty tantamount to a lot of what I call secondary education, meaning it's not what's reported in the media, it's not the way it's communicated to a lot of people. And so, Pastor Baines, that brings me to a question for you. When we're talking about wealth disparities, when we're talking about a lack of access to capital, it really starts with education. It starts with knowing what redlining is and that it still exists, although camouflaged oftentimes in many different ways. It starts with the education of understanding that San Mateo County still has a host of deed restrictions in particular neighborhoods. How do we communicate that information to people as they're trying to navigate a system that was very strategically and effectively designed against them as Black people?
Well, yeah, and you teed this up very nicely. you know, and I'll go from a biblical perspective. The Bible says our people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And knowledge to me is only powerful when wisdom is applied. And so, one, we have to have a greater awareness of the issues, the structural issues, because the system is designed exactly what it's supposed to do, and it's done it very well. And that's keep certain people in certain places and then keep certain people out of certain places. So we got to own that. It's not, we're not saying that we're accusing anyone in this very day and age, but the system is doing exactly what it is designed to do. So that means we, as those who are informed, who are woke, and particularly those who are in leadership positions, we have to help, one, bring greater education to the issue and awareness to these issues, and use our platforms more than just for maybe a myopic perspective of what we're working on that day. We have to look at the greater good to unravel the systemic issues that particularly marginalized communities face on a daily basis. And it's structural. So that means we have to unstructure the structure that's currently in place. And that means talking with, our supervisors, talking with our mayors, talking with our council people, talking with our business leaders, because we are in a area where we are under-resourced, we have overbuilt. And so if someone here has started off behind at the very beginning, then they're definitely not going to be in a position to catch up. And typically those people that are behind are the ones that started off behind, which is mostly Black and brown people. And so now that we know that, then we have to look at how do we come together, Black, brown, white, Asian, all of us come together and look at a more equitable approach and strategy to unravel these systemic issues that have put us centuries behind, not just decades, but centuries behind.
Wow. It's incredible to really understand and start to navigate the web of the design and the strategy, as you mentioned. And when we start to learn that there is affordable housing going up in San Mateo County, there's certainly a wealth of condos and apartment complexes. And oftentimes there are policies and provisions in place that allow for a portion of those to be allocated to lower income residents. But what if I don't know about that? How do I become educated on what those policies and laws say if I'm not clear on the fact that my life is now dictated, albeit a lack of freedom again, from those policies and laws? And I simply think that I'm going to apply for an apartment. I'm just trying to find a place to live, or I don't work for one of the companies that potentially purchase a lot of these apartments in these buildings. So they're no longer available to Black people or people who are trying to understand the system because it's such a deep dive into that web that I just spoke of. So Darius, what would your response to that be if someone is really trying to become more aware and educate themselves? Where might they start with education? We don't want to go back to 1865 and unpack everything that we know historically, but we have to do something. And at the very least, people need to be able to make an informed decision. And that starts with awareness. How would they do that?
So first of all, I'm a policy guy, but I'm a community organizer at heart, right? And one of the things that we are trying to do with our Black housing piece is also this piece around capacity building for Black-led organizations, right? And for other organizations as well, because I think that it comes through the educational pieces to enlighten people who are the most neediest. It should come from community-based organizations being able to hold meetings, community meetings. And I think that also goes to another thing that has impacted us when it comes to the housing piece is that those institutions that were the conduit of information for the African American community, whether it be North and South. That was the church, right? And so you have to figure out and realize they were able to, in Montgomery, Alabama, to organize a boycott that shut down the whole bus system. But it was because they had these systems of communication where you could go out and educate people and enlighten people. So for me, I would say that it's looking into when we do our funding mechanisms, and we can start with how the American Rescue Plan Act dollars were allocated throughout every county, right? They need to be allocated in a way so that the community-based organizations and churches can go out and educate people and show people whole places so that they will know. And I think it's just a great lack of information because our information networks are underfunded, and that has to be. If you don't bring it to the people from the grassroots, right? You know where they are, you go get them, but you have to have the resources to be able to do that. And so it's that old-fashioned getting out and getting the information, but in this day and age, we have to be funded in order to get it done. Whether it's getting the people to places, through transportation, vouchers, or anything that's needed to get them to where the information is, we have to go out and give it to them and organize around it.
So this is a continuation of your comment for both you and Monet. Do you think if those resources are made available, that people still have the energy and the enthusiasm to continue the journey to access that information? Because it's very daunting and it becomes exhausting quickly. If you are in fact trying, you've decided to go forward, you know the odds are against you. And now there's a new set of challenges that you're faced with informing yourself and educating yourself, again, about different processes, not even policies, but processes to try and secure pride within your family and pride within your community hub, and that's having a place to live. Home ownership comes later. We're talking about shelter first. So do you think that interest is present, or do you think that people are wholly exhausted with the effort?
I think it's both, especially now, especially in the era of what we call COVID. People have gone through a long season of hardship, right? And I think that just talking to other individuals that I've been having conversation with our most marginalized people are living in a conditions where they see there's some resignation and hopelessness, right? Especially, if you're a person, take for instance, you may be unhoused, right? And you've gone to agency after agency, places to get where you need to get in order to get your family housed, but now, for 2 or 3 months, and then you're still couch surfing, working homelessness, right? It could be exhausting, and I do think that people are have become exhausted, but nevertheless, I think that we have to look at how do we as community-based organizers, right, make it so they are able to go through a streamlining process, and then that process starts bearing fruit. You're not just going from one hotel voucher to the other, one room key to another, places like that, but you're actually seeing the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And unfortunately, it's not just in San Mateo County, California, but it's a problem that's happening nationwide for us.
Monet, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think just a piece. I know our people have gone through so much, especially when it comes to housing and all these like daunting processes, but I also know that our people are resilient. And when it comes to being housed and having a roof over their head, I know folks will will go out and seek those options. But I think when we ask those questions, I think sometimes we put the so much on the resident and on the people. I think for those affordable housing developers, there needs to be more requirements around involving community. And if it's a resident-centered and community-centered project, they need to be at the forefront and at the center of it. So does that mean that you need to do your community planning and you're at the school? Do you need to go to the church? Or whatever it may be, to get and make it convenient for these folks to speak about what they need and the affordability options that they need. So I think folks most definitely try to educate themselves in the best way that they can. But I also feel that we need to put more pressure on developers that are bringing in these large developments and aren't including community and are not asking them, how can I make this process easier and better for you? What works best for you and your family? You're a single mom, or I know that you and your partner are struggling right now. How can I make this easier for you to access housing? That is why I'm bringing this property to you. And so I think we need to start having those conversations more and having all people accountable, because it's not the residents' fault that they're in this system and in this structure, right? So we need to figure out how we can change these systems and put more pressure on them so that it works for resident and community centered.
If I could add to that, Cleature, if that's okay, that
Please, absolutely.
we really have to hold our elected officials accountable. That means we don't just show up one time, but we have to show up consistently. And it's not just to talk about the issue, but have already discussed amongst ourselves, being people of color or people who are marginalized, and saying, this is what we feel are some of the best practices that have maybe been implemented over in Texas or implemented in New York, something that's comparable to where we live as far as cost of land and things of that nature, and say, why can't we do this here in this particular San Mateo County or in the Bay Area? And we can't just do that once. We have to continually bring this before them, because it's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. And so if you look at I think it was the Federal Boston Bank that did a survey of household income, and it was like Blacks had $700 in liquid or illiquid assets compared to whites, which had 257,000 assets. And so we're starting off behind, because one, we were enslaved, and we couldn't buy land because we weren't getting paid. But even now, when we do get paid, we're getting paid minimum wage. We're not getting paid the same amount that our counter male, non-Black, non-people of color is getting paid, just like women's not getting paid the same amount to do the same job as a man is getting paid. So we have these disparities still that are structural in nature that we have to dismantle. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to keep fishing upstream, as opposed to, saying, oh, enough is enough. Let's put some things that we know are best practices that are working somewhere else. Let's implement them here locally.
I think it's worth mentioning that, when we go back to Special Order number 15 and this allocation of 40-acre lots for freed men who were formerly enslaved, that wasn't a singular conversation. And this is important because the conversation really resulted between a Union general at the time and a host of pastors and preachers in what was then the region, to determine what was necessary and what was needed in order for these now freed Black people to move forward. And so I bring that up in response to what all of you have mentioned in terms of community involvement and really attending, like you said, Pastor Banks, not just once, but being present and being counted and having the conversation to say, we have a vested interest here. We want to make sure that there's a dialogue happening around what's best for the people that you are intending to serve. And I know that it happens sometimes. We all hear and read about it and see about it happening, but there seems to be a connectional gap there with that. And how do you think, and this is for all of you, how do you think that gap can be closed? How do you think we can activate the community and community leaders, grassroots or established levels more than we have in the way that we used to historically, so that there is a dialogue happening, because there is some responsibility around that. And I'm unapologetic about saying, you know, it's important to say what you need and say what you want and then have an expectation. How do we accomplish that?
And I'll say this, and then let the other staff. We have to have a solution-driven mindset as opposed to a problem-consumed mindset. As Monet mentioned earlier, you know, we're a resilient people. Black people are resilient. You know, you give us lemons, okay, we make lemonade, and then we'll make an Arnold Palmer. You know, and so we know how to make things work to the best of our ability. If we could just, you know, equal out the playing field and make the rules known to all the people that's involved, Black, white, Latino, Asian, then, you know, that's a starting process. But it really does get to where we don't want handouts. We want just the rules to be fair and open and clear. And, you know, the relationships that some people have of receiving contracts, you know, we want to be able to create Black businesses so then we can also further create Black wealth, and we can hand that down like it's been done for many, many years, but without Black people involved. So I just want to say that.
Thank you, sir. I think this brings me to my next and final question that I would like for you all to collaborate on in response, in terms of how specifically should we be addressing housing in order to ensure that Black people reach their full potential in San Mateo County? That's a big question. It's very layered and it has a lot of tentacles and arteries, but please.
So that's a tough question, because when you look at it, there's solutions that can be in place. Barhigh, we think we have one of the solutions, which is through our Black Housing Fund and the way it's set up to house people, empower developers to build this virtuous cycle of development. But I also believe that in San Mateo County, there has to be a way to look at how do you bring people back. You know, could there be a right to return? Some of those, look at policies that other cities have set up that are working, right? I think the city and county of San Francisco, when they divested from policing, they invested in people. They put forth, I believe it was $120 million or so into what's called a Dream Keeper initiative, right? And it has components for housing, services and stuff like, and it's looking at, so these are the start with solutions. And then I also think it's incumbent upon governments, county governments, or in city governments to really, really start looking at the Fair Housing Act. Because in retrospect, that was a law that was created for African Americans here in California. It was one of the second Black legislatures, Byron Rumford from Berkeley, California. He was a pharmacist, and he legislated for the Fair Housing Act. And the whole time that he was doing it, he couldn't even stay in the hotel across the street from the Capitol, right? Go figure. But that same law now is actually being used against us, right? A law that was basically built because African Americans could not live in certain places, right? And so I do think if government and they start policies that tend to look at this and look at whatever they call proxies to be able to hold developers and people so that they can get people housed that are of color, right? And they're not, you know, I think that's the first start, right? With looking at solutions that are already there and how can they apply to where here in San Mateo County.
Thank you for that, Darius. Would anyone else like to chime in?
Yeah, I'll go
Yeah.
after Monet.
Oh, I'm sorry, Pastor Bangsman.
No, I said I go after Monet.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna add something quickly. I think I think housing is so central to, especially because we live, like I said again, like we live in a capitalistic society and we need access to wealth, and we must have wealth and home ownership. And I think with so many people, when you have a home or you have the equity in your house to start a business, or you're able to pay for your child's education, or you're able to donate to a community organization, or you're one of the people able to give, or even host space in your home. But even smaller than that, even smaller than that, how you mentioned, Cleisha, we just need shelter. And we know shelter is so important. We saw that in the pandemic. We lost so many Black folks all over in the Bay Area. And we saw that housing, stable housing, is so important for our health, our mental health, and our well-being. Housing is so central. We have to start looking at housing as important, one of the most important pieces of infrastructure. And I also think I'm stop. I think one more thing too is that we need to start looking at a suite of options for people to access housing. I think we're like, okay, we have affordable housing and home ownership, but I think we need to start looking at community land trusts, limited equity models for housing, small dollar mortgages. How are other ways that we can go against the market to help people attain affordability, or just get into market, or like you said, get into shelter? What are the different options that we can look at so people can reach their full potential and have the stability that they need to thrive?
Yeah.
As a person that runs a organization that my wife and I, we hope, we have 137 employees. We have a homeless shelter, 100-bed shelter in San Francisco. It's going to be 100 beds in San Mateo and East Palo Alto, and a variety of other programs. And I look at Black people make up the smallest percentage of the general population, but in many cases, they make up anywhere from 10 to 30% of the homeless population, depending upon where you are and what county you live in. That's disproportionately crazy. But I also know, even while we may be doing some good work, that we cannot solve the homeless problem without having the housing stop. And so, to Monet's point, if we don't have affordable housing, and you have to be careful with that word because affordable is relative on who can afford it. We need to have Eli housing, which is extremely low cost income housing. And so I'm not saying we're talking about JJ back in good times. I'm talking about the Jeffersons. All right. So we want to be able to create that kind of housing. And that's, one of the reasons why my wife and I founded United Hope Builders. We're going to build a housing manufacturing plant in East Palo Alto that's going to do what? It's going to create wealth creation by doing profit sharing with the employees will own 20% of the factory. It's going to create 100 jobs. So we're doing job development, and then we're creating housing, affordable, extremely low income quality housing, upwards of hopefully 300 to 400 homes a year. Now the county has partnered with us. They've given us a grant along with other people to help us bring this to fruition, but we need 10 times those amount of factories in the Bay Area alone because of the crisis of we have, I think it is 20 jobs for every one house, or maybe the figures might be even higher than that. For every, and that's a house period. Now you make it affordable house, you can creep that up over 100. So it's extremely important because if people aren't stable, then it causes health problems, it causes mental health problems, it causes a variety of other problems if they cannot have any type of housing stability. Housing insecurity is a huge issue, and there's a correlation if you don't have it to a bunch of other detriments.
Thank you so much for that, Pastor Baines. And I appreciate all of your contributions to this conversation and the questions that I've asked. I think it's very relative to the Emancipation Proclamation, what we now know today as Juneteenth, in terms of freedom and justice for all, and driving that all the way to land, ownership and essential shelter and housing, which is what we've discussed here tonight. So I'm not really sure that anyone can actually be free indeed without having a place to go home to, wherever that may be. So with that, we're going to open this up to questions from our attendees. And I see already there's a question in the Q&A box. The first question that we have is, what do we need to do today to help migrate this current situation? And anyone, please feel free to respond to that question. And I will continue to read them as they come in.
Well, we have to come together, and that means all ethnicities, all races. We have to come together and understand the issue. And we have to put a plan of action to address the issue. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of here overnight. And we have to be realistic about that. But if we cannot come together to at least discuss and define what the issues are, and I think tee up potential solutions, there's models all around the country that I believe we can bring here to help address the issue. There's no one silver bullet, but I believe there is a lot of silver buckshots.
So I tend to sometimes think like out of the box in a different way, because I see it as this American problem, right? Housing, jobs, and all these things. And so the question is, what can we do today? Is that we have to, I think it's already been said, we just have to start like really, really calling out our government, right? Whether it's your state government, federal government, on their priorities. And we can't keep sending the same people to office on the same promises that aren't being kept once they take the seat, right? And I just think that it's the solution, one of the solutions, what we can do today is make it known that, to our political leaders that it's unacceptable, and we have to reprioritize our priorities.
Thank you both for that response. So Pastor Baines, the next question is for you, and it asks if you can share how we can learn more about the United Hope Builders. That sounds like a promising project.
You can go on unitedhopebuilders.org. It is something that our City of East Palo Alto and the County of San Mateo supports, along with a host of foundations, Chan Zuckerberg, Packard Foundation, Palo Alto Community Fund. These are just some of the partners that are with us. And I'll put my email in the chat. I'll be more than happy to talk to you about it, because we're going to make a difference. And even if it's at one household at a time, but we're going to make a difference to help the marginalized. We're not building this for market rate. We're building this strictly for 30% AMI folks. That's your area medium income folks. So that's your working poor, and that's our unhoused brothers and sisters. So we're not doing it for show or dough, but we're going to make a difference.
There you go. I love
There
that.
you go.
Yeah. Okay, our next question is, would rent controls help in any way? And anyone, again, please feel free to chime in and participate in the answer.
Well, okay. I think rent control helps to help stabilize communities that where if you look at East Palo Alto and Eastern Menlo Park, you know, people are basically living from paycheck to paycheck. And so, you know, we've had this great extradition of people who live in low income housing by landlords who I believe were greedy by saying they're going to remodel their homes, and then they ask the tenants to go to another spot, find another place to live, and we can come back after they remodel it. Then they've jacked it up, sometimes 100 to 200 to 300% from what they were currently paying. And so that, to me, if you didn't have rent control, that then would just exasperate that issue to the point where only people that be living here is high income wage earners, and that would be a select group of people. Those are just my thoughts.
And I would echo those same thoughts. Comes to rent control. It's needed.
Okay. So there's a question in the Q&A with regards to the process of adding an ADU, which is an in-law housing unit in the county. And this is specific to, I believe, Santa Clara County, which this evening we're talking more about San Mateo County. But I think that adding ADUs or somehow trying to maximize the opportunity and equity if you do own a home is a reasonable question that perhaps someone could address. Not the process of how to, but maybe more understanding the what is and the why.
Now, I'm a preacher, so I can keep talking. So,
keep going.
All
We're
right.
here for you,
So
Pastor Van.
ADU stands for accessory dwelling unit. And so it's also called nanny's quarters, mother-in-law's quarters. It's basically another unit on your property that you can have. And we're grateful for San Mateo County and the state of California, and particularly the city of East Palo Alto, for passing laws that makes it easier for someone to put an ADU on their property. And what that can do is, if everyone did it, not that everyone has to do it, because some people don't want to have all of that near them. They want more privacy, and they're welcome to do that. That's their choice and prerogative. But if we added one to, say, half the homes, could we solve the housing crisis? Yes. And half the homes in California, we could solve the housing crisis. And it's not really extremely costly to do something like that. And so the why that's important is because you're adding housing stock to a housing crisis. And so, you know, it's actually a brilliant idea, and it's why I believe the state of California has eased the regulations on allowing that to happen. Does it create some other problems? It can. You know, you have to look at traffic. You have to look at overcrowding in certain areas if it's a high condensed area. So those are real life issues, but we could figure out a way to address that and work through that. It's just if someone's willing to bring on an ADU, there's many different organizations out there that can help you to do that. East Palo Alto can do, and East Palo Alto is one organization, and there's many some college grads have thought of this some very high technological software that says before you even get started, it tells you if you can or should put an ADU or the size of the ADU that you can put in your backyard, and it does it for free. The name of the company escapes me, but you can get it through East Palo Alto Can Do. They can let you know.
That's a phenomenal resource to share. Thank you so much for that. I hope the person that posed the question was able to receive that information and jot down the contact to look into it and explore it more. The next question that we have is, what role is gentrification playing in the housing crisis? That's a great question.
So I would say it has a big role, but it's for different reasons. So like for instance, you know, people get old and they want, instead of big homes, they want smaller homes. So they sell their home. But the problem is that when they sell the home is that African American homeowners, their houses are appraised at much less than what they're actually worth. So they're forced to sell them at lower rates. Other people, they come in, they can buy them at that rate, and then they ended up reselling them for higher. And so that's the role that gentrification is playing in this crisis. We got to a point, I think you can look at, you know, places like Oakland, you can go to places like Richmond and even San Francisco. And it was during that time of the housing crisis in 2008 where people, you know, older people began to sell and move, but their houses were appraised at much lower rates. Other people came in, they were able to afford to buy them even at those rates, and then once they got them, they sold them at even higher prices, which kept you know, people of color from coming back into, you know, buying in those communities and neighborhoods. So yes, it is playing a part. And I think you can go to any major city. You can go to you know, the city of Berkeley the same way. I went to junior high school there, and it was at that time it was 40% African Americans, and now it's like the junior high is like 3% African Americans. So you go, you know, you think about that, right? You know, the high schools as well. So yeah, it's playing a big part. Then
Anyone else
appraisal.
have comments about gentrification? Thank you, Darius, for that response.
Well, I just say that it's happening in marginalized communities, which is typically people of color on steroids, because you have people who already have created wealth, and they come in and they take something that someone else didn't have. They were either denied for a loan to fix up their house because they had maybe a credit blimp on there, and then they get in trouble maybe because they can't keep up because they have medical bills, or car crash caused them to drain their savings because they just didn't have a lot of money. So what do? They end up, someone comes along, you see the signs in particularly East Palo Alto, we'll buy your house, we'll give you cash. Well, you don't see none of those signs in Palo Alto. You see them only in East Palo Alto, or Redwood City, you know, where they trick the people of saying, look, here's $25,000, you'll be free and clear, you may be behind. We have to remember the foreclosure crisis devastated people of color, particularly Black folks, you know, where we were, and like in East Palo Alto, and Monet said this, 60% of the people in East Palo Alto, Blacks, are gone. A lot of that had to do with them losing their homes in the foreclosure crisis because of predatory lending. They came in, they said, hey, you know, we'll give you $60,000 for your house, and you don't have to worry about paying us. And then they didn't realize they had a balloon payment later on, and then now they defaulted on that balloon payment. And these are people that have come to me and said, Pastor, this is what's going on, and we've been able to save some people, but that's like 10% of the people that had lost their house to predatory lending. Now they've lost their home. The people who own it now take it and they sell it for 3 times the amount after putting in a little, maybe 20 grand into the home. So that's part of the issue that we need to know about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that issue being, of course, back to the systemic design and strategy that we've spoken about tonight. So that's definitely a clear example of how it plays out in terms of gentrification for sure. So as we begin to wrap up tonight's conversation, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share with regards to housing in San Mateo County, freedom for Black people and people of color, and what we can all consider and use as takeaways as we go out into the world tomorrow with hopefully an elevated awareness.
Monet, you first.
Sure. I think Juneteenth is such a powerful holiday because it's liberation for Black folks in America, and it represents so much. But we know that there are a lot of barriers that Black folks still face, and so I think it's really important for folks who are allies and to the Black community, and who want to understand the Black experience. I think it's important to not always lean on Black people to explain all of our experience and explain the history of all the things that we have gone through, and how Cleature alluded to, that can be daunting and traumatizing to re-explain that all the time. And there are a lot of resources out there for folks to be better allies, for folks to learn about the different types of solutions out there for and create solutions for and with Black communities. So I think that is a piece I would say for freedom, is just continuing to be an ally and to be in partnership with Black people and educate yourselves on how to be better, and also have a solution mindset when you see these problems.
Well, thank you. Go ahead, please.
I just want to also say that we as Black people, we also need to understand that there are people out there that want to help. They want to help address the issue. And some of them are really woke, that they will put their time, their talent, and their treasure, where their mouth is. And so, if I look at examples of people who are very affluent people that are actually digging in to these issues, and these are non-Black folks, but they are looking to help to level the playing field. I think that is just a wonderful thing. So we as Black people, we need to understand that there's only a few of us here, a few of us left here in the Bay Area, and that none of us is as strong as all of us. We are better together than we are apart. If we can just come together more than what we've been doing, more than just over George Floyd and all these other things, it's a journey that we have to go on. And organizations like the Grove Foundation, the San Francisco Foundation, these are organizations that want to help us, okay? And they are putting their time, talent, and treasure, where their mouth is. So.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Pastor Baines. I think that was a great way to end this webinar. We appreciate all of you for participating. I personally believe that communication and conversation can serve as a bridge over troubled water. And hopefully we've done a portion of that here this evening. So we appreciate everyone holding space. Join us next week on June 21st, next Tuesday, for a conversation around education and the impacts of Juneteenth as we continue San Mateo County Juneteenth 2022. We'd like to recognize and appreciate the County of San Mateo for hosting this webinar series, and also a reminder to view any recordings and also the amazing flag raising that happened on June 3rd, all online at the county's website. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.